Lessons for Saving Democracy, hosted by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation and the Nonviolent Action Lab. My name is Ami Fields-Meyer. I am a senior fellow here at the Allen Lab at the Ash Center, and thrilled to have everybody here. Before we dive in, I would just share a few quick announcements. First, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Second, today's discussion is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you by email following the event. It'll also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. And there will be time for questions from the audience toward the end of our conversation. And you could submit those questions at any time throughout the discussion using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Again, I just wanted to introduce myself. I will be moderating. I am Ami Fields-Meyer, a senior fellow here in the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Ash Center, and where my work focuses on strategies, learning from the strategies of global dissidents and on anti-authoritarian activists and opposition leaders in backsliding democracies. And I've done some writing on that and previously worked at various policy jobs across the government. I want to also introduce at the beginning of this conversation the two other participants in today's conversation, Andrea Pitzer and Erica Chenoweth. Andrea Pitzer is a journalist and the author of 3 books, including One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps, which traces the idea of mass civilian detention without trial from its beginnings. She is known for unearthing lost or forgotten history and for exploring the events and ideas and lessons humanity tends to forget. Her writing has appeared in many places, including the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and New York, and she's reported from detention facilities on 4 continents. Erica Chenoweth is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute. Erica studies political violence and its alternatives and has authored or edited 9 books and dozens of articles on mass movements, nonviolent resistance, terrorism, political violence, revolutions, and state repression. Erica's current book, Project: The End of People Power, investigates the puzzling decline in the success of civil resistance movements in the past decade, even as the technique has become more popular worldwide. And both Erica and Andrea are, in my view, generational intellects, but they also represent a wellspring of moral clarity and moral leadership. So thank you both for being with us for this important and timely discussion. In the last few months, the US government has sent hundreds of immigrants without due process to a prison in El Salvador. Most of these people had been convicted of no crimes in the United States and were sent away with no trial and no charges. At the same time, we've seen that others who are legally present in the US have been whisked away from their families and their places of work, often by masked agents, to face deportation proceedings without due process. And just in the last few days, the National Guard has been deployed to Los Angeles against the wishes of state and local leaders, and so have the United States Marines. And it can be difficult in the heat of the moment to really understand the implications of these events and to figure out how to apply what we've learned from previous moments in history to now. So the goal of this conversation before we jump in is twofold. First, we're going to try to answer what is really going on here, where and when have we seen this before, if ever, and what can we learn from the past? And second, what can each of us do about it? So the questions that I am going to pose to Andrea and Erica are woven together from the questions submitted by folks in our audience, and let's just jump in. So Andrea, I want to start with a question that I'm sure that folks in our audience have, which is why are we talking about the history of concentration camps today? You've been writing a lot about this. When people hear that phrase, they tend to think of World War II and this horrific images from that era. Isn't that an extreme comparison to what we're seeing happening in the US today? Say a little bit on that.
So first, I want to take a minute to thank the Allen Lab and the Ash Center and Harvard, and especially you, Ami, for brainstorming this and putting it together. Honored to be here and to be with Erica, whose research I think is fantastic. As you mentioned, when people hear the phrase concentration camp, the first thing they do tend to think of is Auschwitz. And I would argue that that's correct, and they should, because of the genocidal intent and the scale of deaths, which reached over 1 million people at a single camp in that era. And the overwhelming majority of them, of course, were European Jews targeted for extermination as a race, as were the Roma and Sinti, then called Gypsies. So Auschwitz, for that reason alone, should be the first thing that we think of. But I would suggest it should also be the second thing that we think of when we think of concentration camps, because 2 years before the death camp rose at Auschwitz, Auschwitz itself was part of the existing Nazi camp system. It existed as a part of a massive system that had been launched within weeks of Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany and had taken years to devolve to the point that we wound up with something like Auschwitz. Along the way, it crushed a free society, did vast harms to thousands who died long before the death camps ever arrived. And you can't get to that extreme endpoint without going through those harrowing years of camps that happened between 33 and 42. And so today I want to give people a little perspective on how we even got to that point, because the path actually begins decades earlier. And we're going to recognize a lot of the phenomenon that happened in those other places. And so first, just let me say a little about what a camp is, because people may not have thought about it. You kind of went over it quickly, but I'll say in a little more detail. In my book, I define concentration camps as the mass detention of civilians without any real trial or defense on the base of a person's identity, so race, religion, ethnicity, political affiliation, rather than any criminal act that they've committed. And whether a country is a democracy or not, the camp phenomena is one that is typically an add-on to whatever is the existing legal system. It's kind of glommed on like a tumor to the existing country's legal system. And these kinds of camps appeared in the back end of the 19th century in colonies and territories around the world, typically as a way to suppress independence movements. They rose out of pre-existing kinds of detention. I'm not going to say this was created wholesale out of nothing, but two technological advances made modern camps really possible. And those are the patenting and mass production of barbed wire and automatic weapons. And that's the revolutionary moment, the transformative moment where you need a very small guard force to be able to control a tremendous amount of people. And of course, that has all kinds of other repercussions for repression, not just in camps. But right now, we'll focus on camps. Those first colonial camps were seen as monstrous and uncivilized and an aberration, and they happened in a few different places with a few different actors. But the upshot of that first decade of camps as we came into the 20th century was that they were seen as horrible. But with World War I, there was this rehabilitation of camps that happened. And there was this idea of enemy aliens that could be locked up, that were seen as a danger to the community, whether they were a suspected spy or whether they were some German baker living in London for 30 years. There was a flattening of this into just pure identity. And suddenly these things that had been seen as a oppressive tool around the world came right into the heart of empire. And during the war, you wound up with hundreds of thousands detained in dozens of countries. And of course, they weren't committing the same kind of atrocities that they did in the colonial regions. And so at the end of World War I, you wound up with camps sort of being rehabilitated as a normal thing to do. Horrible things kept happening. The roots of the Soviet Gulag go back to the 20s, right after the war. But in the meanwhile, you find camps used for all kinds of purposes, most frequently in Europe and the Americas for the detention of the homeless, for the removal of the homeless from streets. And you also see it used in things like the Tulsa Race Massacre, where surviving Black people in the wake of the race were actually detained in camps for a period of time. So it just became ubiquitous. It became normal. People learned to turn themselves in when they were told to get a number. and to kind of wait out whatever the crisis was. And based on World War I, and what happened in the interwar period, people had a pretty good idea they were going to come out of these camps, which is all the setup for the Nazi camps that are so familiar to us when so many people didn't come out. And even in the first years of those, most people were released. It isn't until the war and the death camps and the desperate conditions of a losing Germany that you start to see that death toll creep into the millions. And so I think that's why this phrase has been attached so strongly to Auschwitz, because it looms so large in our memory. And that's important and worthwhile. But the downside is everything that came before it got erased from popular memory. And in fact, that's what we're seeing recapitulated. That's what we're reliving. That's actually what started up again right after World War II. People just stopped calling them concentration camps. And thankfully, it has never again risen to that level of Auschwitz. But I think it's incumbent on us right now to realize the ways we're repeating that earlier history, and so that we can halt or reverse the momentum that's carrying us down that same path.
Thank you, Andrea, uh, for that sort of panoramic view. And I think we're going to get into more specific and concrete examples as we progress in the conversation. Erica, I want to turn to you. From your own work, what is the use of detention in camps, both in the past and sort of other parts of the world, tell us about what folks in the US should be thinking about right now?
Yeah, thank you, Ami. And let me add my thanks to you and the Ash Center and Andrea for being able to learn from and participate in this conversation. So, maybe I'll pick up a little bit on where Andrea left off. I mean, the United States in World War II, upon its entry into World War II, really set up its own internment camp system, which was authorized by FDR under an executive order that he issued after Pearl Harbor, authorizing the forced relocation and incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans in numerous internment camps, largely in the American West and Southwest. And that was purely on the basis of kind of war hysteria, racial prejudice, sort of collective assignment of blame to Pearl Harbor, to people who shared, a sort of national origin with the perpetrators of that, or ancestral line. And I would say, executive overreach, which in fact is something that has been acknowledged first formally in the late 80s by President Ronald Reagan, who issued a formal apology and authorized the payment of reparations to people who had been incarcerated during that time. Now, of course, at the time, the Supreme Court upheld the right of the president to engage in this, but it's since kind of been regarded as one of the most shameful episodes in U.S. history, never to be repeated. And I think that, the thing to know about that level of response is that it's something that occurred at that time in the context of a world war, right? And in the context of what FDR viewed to be a national emergency. And yet these are tools that governments can use when they also manufacture emergencies, right? And even in the context of understanding that it took place in the World War, the United States President Ronald Reagan still issued an apology about the fact that it had happened and said it wasn't justified, even in that extreme context. So then you can imagine, what kind of context would justify it? I think the answer is basically none. If you look back at the way that U.S. has regarded that episode. I just want to say a couple other things about like immigration detention in particular. There's a large kind of community in the sort of human rights space that has long been arguing that there's no such thing as like a humane detention center. And they've sort of been documenting all the ways in which detention is an intrusion on personal liberty and basic dignity, that it's very difficult to create the conditions of life in any type of camp that concentrates a large number of people in a small and enclosed space. The more crowded they become, the more dangerous they become. If there's a power outage in the summer and it's hot and air conditioning can't get in, things like that, it becomes like a life and death situation quite quickly. People held in detention can be subject to punitive treatments like solitary confinement. And when ordinary life is interrupted at all, for instance, when one is detained at work and one has children, this can affect whole families and whole communities. So it's sort of difficult to put into words like the emotional and psychological impacts of even a brief encounter with a system in which somebody is, taken out of their ordinary course of life and placed into, a detention center like this. And also very difficult for, people to access things like legal counsel, a basic violation of due process and all the other things. So I think that the bottom line is, in the human rights community anyway, there's a general consensus, and even there was a UN working group that basically issued a recommendation saying that these things should be not used in immigration law enforcement at all, that there are plenty of alternatives to detention centers, and that there are just too many unavoidable ways in which detention centers recreate conditions of extreme deprivation and control that just can't be justified under contemporary human rights norms. So I just want to put that out there right at the front, and mention that there's a large group of people who've been working on this for a long time, and I can go into some more details about the reasons why and the impacts on people who are both detained and the people who detain them, in coming to that consensus.
Thanks, Erica. Andrea, you have a name in your book for the phenomenon that Erica is describing and that you're describing. You call it the concentration camp tendency, the desire to exclude those deemed undesirable from society and sort of carry on as though they didn't exist. And more recently, you said, I think on your podcast, that tendency is the quote I have here is the necklace threading through all the policies that are currently choking the country, and taking off one or two beads is not going to be enough to save us. So tell us what you mean by that, and tell us maybe a little bit more about what you call the concentration camp tendency. And you're muted.
You have to be able to hear me. Okay. So it actually dovetails really well with what Erica was just saying, which is it's important to note up front, because this is true of camp systems as a whole, of immigrant detention of every kind. When you create these kinds of systems, the longer they last and the bigger they get, the more that the momentum they develop can do harm far beyond anybody's intention. And when you have bad actors with bad intentions, that's still true. They can kind of become worse than anybody's dream. But even when people might have what we would see as fairly innocent intentions, they don't really want to do harm to these people, it is actually impossible to conduct these kinds of things on any scale for any length of time in any institutional way without creating that bureaucracy and momentum of harm. And so I just want to say that, and seconding everything she said about Japanese American internment, which is also included in my book and I see as part of the concentration camp phenomenon, albeit a lesser mortality impact in some place like Auschwitz. It's still an incredibly devastating experience, both to those inflicting it and, of course, more significantly to those who had to try to survive it. But as far as this concentration camp tendency, that's all a part of this, because we see the secret detention that Ami mentioned already in El Salvador. We see attempts to expand a U.S. detention network to Panama, Libya, South Sudan, and Rwanda, and they're just getting started, right? And administration representatives appear to be trying to use the most punitive locations they can imagine. So in this case, it feels like it isn't a lack of intention, that there is some deliberate effort here to make this actively punitive. It's the deliberate, I would argue, the deliberate imposition of terror. And domestically, we're seeing work sites raided to take parents into custody. We're seeing people following the law showing up at courthouses for for hearings that are scheduled, only to have their cases dropped and then be arrested. We see mothers at hospitals, and we see sort of, elementary school graduations. We're seeing this deliberate attempt to move it into the civil sphere, not to isolate it, not to focus on criminals as was originally said, but it's now sort of becoming this terror phenomenon. As the most powerful voice on detention policy today in the US, Stephen Miller, in terms of who has the administration's ear, when he publicly claims that America is for Americans only, this has real significance. Talking about ending birthright citizenship and denaturalizing citizens does too. And I think that it's an open and direct thing, but it plays out, this concentration camp tendency of excluding people plays out in a lot of different ways. And the Washington Post just had a great opinion piece the other day on which reliable information about the demographics of various targeted groups is literally being erased from federal databases. It's vanishing from our collective knowledge as a nation. And so I would say that given some of those sort of contextual points, right now we're sitting at the midpoint of a long trajectory in which political leaders have demonized communities like immigrants, trans people, and the homeless, or allowed them to be demonized. And I'm not saying that it's not nice or cruel, although it is not nice and it is cruel. I'm saying that when you start doing this kind of exclusion, it's an incredibly dangerous thing for a society to go into, because you are opening that door. That concentration camp tendency opens the door to literal physical exclusion and erasure of targeted communities. And it isn't just sort of a feel good, you should help other people first they came for, the way, that is sometimes contextualized from the Nazis. It's actually the beginning of the destruction of a self-governing society. And so I would say that the concentration camp tendency in these small ways of rhetoric of exclusion and laws kind of trying to get people off the streets or out of view or to not recognize their rights in some way, this is what actually, every single time that countries do this over an extended period, you end up with some of the camp situations that we've already identified today. And so that's what I would describe the concentration camp tendency as.
Thanks, Andrea. Erica, where do you see us in that trajectory? Help us sort of situate us in time.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have, really important knowledge about the things that happen to people and to societies as a whole under these conditions, and how they regard people who are, basically being scapegoated. So there's an important kind of social and cognitive psychologist named Albert Bandura, who's written a lot about what he calls mechanisms of moral disengagement. And these are basically like rhetorical and practice-based ways that people begin to regard others with much less empathy, and also, it sort of allows governments to sort of regard certain categories of people as criminal as such. And, in his book, Final Solutions, Ben Valentino, who's a political scientist, talks about the fact that where authorities tend to treat people like criminals, not because what they've done, but as a function of how the government wants to treat them, people become treated less than human because they've been forced into inhumane conditions. Right. So it's actually the inhumane conditions that begin to justify in the minds of the people doing the internment that people deserve it. Like they must have, engaged in some kind of criminal activity in order to be in a position where their captor has to inflict moral injury upon them. So the sort of mechanisms, it's sort of a self-reinforcing moral logic that occurs with 8 sort of different aspects. The first is just reinterpreting their own immoral behavior as morally justifiable by framing it in terms of positive values, like we're doing this for the nation, for redefining the nation, using euphemistic labeling, like sanitized language that downplays the harm that an action causes, so calling things sweeps or whatever, as opposed to raids and assaults on a community. kind of justifying harmful behavior by comparing it to worse actions or outcomes. So saying, well, what we're doing is nothing compared to, Auschwitz or whatever, and using kind of hyperbolic examples to sort of, basically minimize the real harms that are being done, even if they're short of, a sort of genocidal episode. Displacing responsibility, so always shifting responsibility for actions onto others or external factors, like there's sort of an unresolved immigration crisis in the United States, and therefore this is required and there's no choice, things like that, or displacing responsibility onto others, diffusing responsibility onto a group or collective decision makers. So I'm just doing my job is the classic way of doing that. Distorting consequences, so minimizing the harm of actions. So the sort of claims that people would make that people are treated very well, in these conditions. Dehumanizing people is stripping them of their human qualities by referring to them as subhuman. That reduces empathy and moral concern for their well-being. And then the final one is the attribution of blame to the victims themselves. So blaming the victims themselves for the harm they experience by calling them criminals, or referring to them in some hostile way that suggests that they should be subject to these harms. So those are the sort of mechanisms that a lot of the scholarship has identified as like the way that societies desensitize themselves and allow themselves to allow this to happen, right? And so I think the most important thing to know is that some of these are very deliberate, rhetorical strategies. Some of them might be more subconscious, but all of them can lead people to justify even the worst abuses of human rights and atrocities. And so they are errors to be corrected. And when we notice that they're being used rhetorically to justify actions that violate people's rights, we should correct them when we see them and reframe each one of those 8 elements to the posture that would be more rights respecting.
There are a number of questions in just at the risk of not acknowledging the many good questions that are coming in and that already came in before this event. There are a number of questions in the chat that in the Q&A about this question of public sentiment and public narrative. So Eric, I appreciate you specifically addressing this, and Andrea, if those are themes that come up in future answers, I think that folks will appreciate them. But let me sort of move us back in time to other moments in history, some of the moments in history where some of what Erica has just described, where we've gotten that data, other parts of the world where governments have used camps and arbitrary detention as a weapon against people in their own countries. Andrea, talk to us about some concrete examples from the past and other parts of the world that feel relevant today. What feels different today? And we want to get back on audio, Andrea.
All right, I'm just trying to keep you from having to hear all my humming and hawing in between. So I'll add to what Erica said in sort of going into that, because it's a natural transition, that in fact, the way that a lot of these kinds of populations have been targeted in the past and some of what we're seeing now actually can force people to live illegally. So you make these measures against a community and they're not criminals, but you create conditions in which a community may not be able to exist except through criminal means. And this is also a key thing, along with many of the things that she named. And I think we're seeing that now in terms of changing what kinds of charges you have if you cross the border. I mean, there's really specific ways, but that goes back to things like in the first years of Nazi Germany, the Jews as a collective were not rounded up and targeted in the first years of the camps. Rather, until Kristallnacht, 5 years after the camps were established, they were targeted legally, and they were made restrictions. They couldn't hold certain posts. They couldn't use certain public places. They couldn't own certain things. They couldn't affiliate in certain ways. And so there's this literal rendering of a people, their existence illegal. And then, of course, at that point, almost any of them can be rounded up at the time you decide to do that. And so there's some repetition of that I would say is similar. Some other sort of pre-camp and early camp congealing I see going on, lists of enemy aliens, expansion of that category, and the public portrayal of them as criminal, kind of outside the bounds of the intended statute, using police and military to reinforce irregular arrests and detention, the monitoring and prosecution of student activists, propaganda-style targeting of trans and queer people, which also happened as the Nazis rose to power. There's so many parallels to offer. I'll speed run a few and then talk about differences a little bit. On things directly related to camp detention rather than that early congealing, I would say what we're doing to immigrants and protesters mimics the attempts to terrorize Jews into self-deportation in Nazi Germany during those earlier years. And it also echoes the measures removing Rohingya Muslims from their home communities and into camps outside cities a decade ago in Myanmar. And the combining of databases to better target vulnerable populations for mistreatment was an important part of several camp systems. And this is something we see the federal government actively doing right now, not with that intention stated, at least, to cause that harm. But again, these things develop their momentum regardless of intention in many situations. And don't forget, going back to the Japanese American camps that Erica mentioned from World War II, that the majority of those Japanese American detainees were US citizens. And that doesn't excuse what we did to the ones who weren't, but literally we renegotiated what the idea of having citizenship was in order to detain those people. So once you're able to detain one group, you just jigger things to do that. And we did it on the basis of Supreme Court rulings that use pretzel logic to justify an obvious wrong, one that naval intelligence at the time had determined was completely unnecessary. So again, there are a lot of those kinds of echoes. On the structural side, we're seeing the kind of just-in-time detention and outsourcing of detention that was a hallmark under Operation Condor of detention policy and torture in South America and even some Central American countries in the 1970s under dictatorship, especially in places like Chile and Argentina and Brazil, where countries collaborated in persecuting their dissidents. And last week we saw the kind of ad hoc detention that's at the beginning of every massive concentration camp system. And we saw it in the basement of the federal building in Los Angeles, where people were detained in not detention facilities, but literally shoved into a basement. Hundreds of people were there. So again, we're seeing sort of metaphorical congealing. We're seeing literal tactics of it. And when those tactics are permitted, they dovetail into all these other things that we are in danger of. But in terms of what's different, I will say we are better poised right now than at, I would say, any country I have studied at any time in history. We have more tools, more knowledge, and more freedom to actually act and work on reversing this. This is a momentum thing. It is not going to be a one-day work. It's going to be a process. So I don't want to make it sound simple, but we have so many tools at hand and so much possibility of things we can do that I think that more than any different thing that the government is doing, that is the main difference of our situation today.
Before I turn to Erica on this question, I want to actually do two things. One is to say that there are a lot of questions in the that have come in that came in before and are coming in now, which is got it, so what do we do? And I want to say that we are shifting in that direction. Part of what we do, I think that both of these scholars and thinkers would tell you, is to have the information to be able to share and to make these arguments. But we will very soon turn to try to get more concrete into interventions. I also want to just ask one question. Andrew, I didn't tell you beforehand that I was going to ask you this, but just because you brought up the Alien Enemies Act question, you have a really interesting nugget in your book, which by the way is right here, One Long Night, and people should get it. But about the origins of the Alien Enemies Act, and that there were sort of a lot of Alien Enemies Acts that were all coming up at the same time in history. Can you tell us just two sentences quickly on that and the ways that actually it was too extreme for many at the beginning of the United States?
Well, I'll touch briefly on that, and I actually want to hit a later thing that's related to that Alien Enemies Act, Enemy Alien Act. I always forget. In Britain, it's one way. In U.S., it's the other. But so it was part of four acts that were on the books in the first decades of U.S. history before 1798, and they were generally seen as egregious. But this act against aliens, which was a more extreme version of something that was part of English common law, stayed on the books in the U.S. to be intermittently used. And with the advent of these camps and global detention in the 20th century, World War I marks particularly when we start to see it weaponized and expanded and how it's used. And the modern part I want to talk about, the relatively modern part I want to talk about, is that after World War II, when those Japanese American camps were shut down, when we stopped that World War II internment, we actually kept camps open. We kept camps open, and Congress passed a law by which the president could declare an emergency and could put dissidents into concentration camps. Truman, at the time, who was president, begged them not to do it and said it was the beginning of totalitarianism. They passed it over his veto.
Hmm.
And the president had that power for decades. And it was taken away by Congress in 1971, I believe. The McCarran Internal Security Act, the Non-Detention Act was passed, and that possibility was removed. So that shows you that sometimes you can start down this path and you can reverse it. And that was a critical reversal. If Nixon had started using that during the 60s protests, it would have been a completely different framework for what happened in America. So I think remembering, and I'm looking forward to now us moving to what we can do, and remembering that even when a very bad situation exists, there are actually almost always a number of options at high political levels and at the grassroots levels that people can be doing.
Thanks. Erica, I want to Andrea just said a lot, so it's sort of an open-ended response before we move into what folks can do. But the question initially, as a reminder, was sort of grounded in concrete examples from the past and other parts of the world. But feel free to respond to any of what Andrea said.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that one of the common explanations for why emergency powers or emergency measures are needed is because there are no alternatives, right, to a particular situation. And it might just be a good time to mention that in the case of immigration, for example, there are many alternatives, and and there are lots of ways to reinvest the huge amounts of money that it takes to build and maintain detention centers, for example, or to come up with agreements with foreign governments to accept people who are deported, et cetera, which is, basically investing in kind of community-based responses, caseworkers, legal counsel. Human Rights Watch, has a report where there was a study done that showed that something like 90% of cases in a sample were compliant with the sort of restrictions placed on them and the legal requirements to check in with courts, et cetera, if they had caseworkers and legal counsel working with them. And so, it's more of a kind of community-based response to dealing with the problem of a very contested immigration policy, but certainly more humane. It keeps families together and allows people to, prosper and at least access the conditions required for life. And so that's a really important thing to know. And like I mentioned, the sort of UN working group devoted to this has recommended just getting rid of immigration detention centers, which, by the way, is not just something that is in the United States. It's in many different countries, right? Probably most countries have immigration detention centers, but the United States has the most people in detention, in immigration detention centers of anywhere in the world. And there are other countries, Belgium, I think, recently made it illegal to keep children in places like this, for example, because of the huge effects that it has on them immediately and in the long term, et cetera. And so there are different laws and standards that have been adopted internationally to begin to sort of reduce the reliance on this as a sort of temporary solution to what is a deeply contested policy issue that there are many different kind of arguments about, but that a lot of countries haven't managed to come to sort of a sensible approach to deal with. But elevating people's rights is never a bad idea when it comes to finding one of those sensible solutions.
So let's move into the present and how this ends. And I want to maybe frame this transition in the conversation by saying that, Andrea, I've heard you say, or maybe write, that there is often a period of maybe 3 to 5 years after camps develop in a society when countries make sort of one of two choices, either to turn away from camps or to speed forward toward, as you've described, something much more lethal. And we know from history about the arc of those competing paths. So I want to just ask about, like, how does this end? What factors lead governments to get off the path of arbitrary detention and camps and isolation in the way that you described? And I sort of pose this question to both of you from the way that you've studied. How does this end, and how do governments ultimately stop? Andrew, why don't we go you and then Erica on this?
So, as I said before, camps are extrajudicial in nature. They're usually tacked on to whatever is existing in a given place at that time. And sometimes laws are rushed through to make it quasi-legal or to legitimate arrest or detention. But this whole approach creates kind of a tension, right? And what I found was usually within 3 to 5 years, there's some kind of power struggle over where it's going to go because it makes the society fundamentally unstable. And I'd like to say it's a moral crisis and countries come to their senses. Typically, it's actually just a raw power struggle between those who would benefit by having sort of the police and traditional military power and have more of that versus the people who are the secret police and surveillance guys and sort of secretly doing all this stuff and having people in camps. And it's usually a conflict between them. And I think there's an argument to be made. We've been kind of been in a quasi state with things like Gitmo, with different things in our history that have put us, and with immigrant detention, frankly, for the last decades, that have had courts intervening. We've been on the knife's edge for a while, but certainly somewhere between 2016 and 2018, when we saw that border crisis really coalesce during the first Trump administration, there was an attempt to unleash a lot. A Muslim ban, border detention, but the system kind of balked and choked on it with both individual and institutional refusals to embrace this wholeheartedly. And then when we had the transition in 2020, we end up with kind of hitting a pause button. So where you think we're at kind of depends on whether you think it started in 2016 or 2018 and how much pause that 4-year pause bought us. But if we've started up again with an embrace of these policies and this approach this year, we're somewhere between year 3 and year 5 already. And I would say we're closer to the end of that than the beginning, because not everything is really fully paused because of our immigration system, because of these other things. So that sounds really scary, and I do want it to be a call to action to people. But I think we still have months, a year, in which we can do a tremendous amount to reverse this, with a lot of things still in place before things would get significantly worse. But you look around and there's already a lot happening, and we've been discussing that. So I more want to switch to how does it end, right? Typically, camps end defeat in war. Think Hitler. Natural death of a cult of personality leader. Think Stalin. Outside intervention or international economic or political pressure. And I would invite US allies to think strongly about that and ways that they could be bracing human rights in a role that the US has sometimes publicly taken in the past. They might do that same thing for us now. I would encourage democratic countries to do that, to reverse extrajudicial detention embracing on our part. But internally, the key historically has been to have at least some judicial independence maintained, and to keep the power and exercise the power for protest and dissent. And I know people talk about performative protest and all this. If you don't even have that, I mean, it is not sufficient, but if you don't even have that, you are truly screwed. So I would say everybody who's showing up for anything right now is actually doing something. In time, that has to include demands, right? It isn't just something to do to show up, but to keep that independent judiciary and preserve it as much as we can by supporting the groups that are keeping it as healthy as it can be in this moment, and the right to protest. And luckily, these are exactly what are available to us. These things that have historically helped end camps are what we have.
Luckily that I happen to have Erica Chenoweth right here, who may be able to weigh in on some of the certainly the latter on the protests, but maybe also on the judicial independence. But this is I want to before we're about to go to specifics. What can individuals do? And maybe just to stay for one more beat at the conceptual level of how does this end? How do these things tend to end in history? What are the factors at a high level? Erica, can you weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally with what Andrea said. It really depends on the response. So certainly in the institutional response, that's a judicial response. In the cases we've seen so far, the judiciary has been pretty resounding in its insistence that, you know what, the Constitution applies to people who are in detention. And you know, they're owed due process, they're owed you know, the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. You know, there are lots of things that where the Constitution, you know, gives people protections that that you know they need to access. The institutions alone have a tough time holding power to account in situations like this, and so how civil society responds is also very important. There are plenty of cases where, for example, activists have mobilized effectively to prevent detention centers from even being built in the first place in their communities. And that just shows that when, you know, when people are able to work quickly and strategically and access the sort of points of power that are the closest to them, that is like their local councils or whoever would approve the, you know, building permits and things like that for a private company to come in and build a detention center, that it can be prevented. And so, you know, a lot of this is based on the sort of mobilization that we're already seeing all around the country of people who don't want this to be the United States policy. And you know, depends on their building the capacity to take the initiative and advance alternatives that ultimately the policymakers will take up.
So I'm going to now drill down into both of your answers and ask you to get even more specific about individuals. I appreciate the theory that both of you have just shared in some of the past, what's worked in the past. I want to say that we have just a note on the last 12 minutes that we have here. There are 19 really good questions, some of which have been addressed. But I'm first going to set up a question about what individuals can do, and then for the time that we have remaining, may just go try to hit some of those. Um, so to land the plane for us, regular people, ordinary people, I want to know what actions ordinary people have played in stopping the trajectory of camps. And obviously, some of this will just relate relate more broadly to anti-authoritarian activism. But one characteristic I think shared by both of your work, Erica and Andrea, is it confronts extremely difficult human realities, violence and exclusion and isolation, and also happens to be quite hopeful in nature and offers actionable insights for sort of cheat codes that people might be able to use. So, which is a reprieve among the nihilism that has darkened some corners of American civic life right now. So, both of you have done a lot of the intellectual heavy lifting to isolate these variables. I want to ask to both of you, help us answer this question. If you are a fill in the blank, a student, a lawyer, an elected official, a teacher, whoever, a worker, what can you do about this concentration camp tendency and the trajectory that we're seeing? And Erica, if you're okay going first on this, I'll turn to you and then to Andrew, but I really want to push y'all both to get as specific and granular as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, if, you know, wherever you're situated, find out who's organizing and where you live and plug in to what they're already doing. There's a lot of efforts underway, and I think you know, the more that they are able to build power, the more they're going to be able to impact the outcome of this. People have lots of resources at their disposal if they are plugged into an organization. Everybody has spheres of influence. They have people they work with, family members, neighbors, whom they can influence if they decide that they want to begin that conversation. And I think that there's lots of research out there be effective and persuasive in these types of ways, but there, the more there could be a shift into the more rehumanizing aspect of what we're talking about, away from the dehumanizing and disengaged aspect of what we're talking about, it will help generate, I think, a collective and shared understanding that the United States can respond in a more productive and humane way that's rooted in values that the country has long had to address a contested policy area. That the sort of extreme responses that are violent and that sow the conditions for atrocities, frankly, are not necessary to engage in the difficult policy questions that we need to do. So I'd say getting organized and not being afraid to have conversations with those that one might personally be able to influence.
Thanks, Erica. Andrea, if you are a fill in the blank, what can you do to get us off this trajectory that both of you have identified?
Well, I have so many examples from camp history, which I'm not going to tell you, but ways that people at every station of life and in every position manage to intervene in ways small and large and completely change sometimes one person's life, sometimes a country. So everybody does have a role.
And if you have one or two, we have a couple
Okay,
minutes.
all right. Hans Beimler, an elected Reichstag deputy who was arrested in the first weeks of Nazi rule after mocking them, wound up in Dachau, but escaped and managed to flee the country and publicize what was happening. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who started out in the army and was sent to the Gulag and ended up mapping the history of that detention. Jane Mutoni Mara, who was detained in Kenya, who was like just a peasant in a village and ended up decades later in London filing suit against the UK for the torture and detention in those camps. Now, most of us are never going to face anything like what these people face, and we don't have to, right? But we have just as much ability or more ability in most cases than they do to act. And so for legislators or others who have some form of official power, I would say refuse to buy into narratives of exclusion about any population, no matter how politically advantageous it might seem in the moment. As Solzhenitsyn said, live not by lies. If you can't go out and force the right thing, you don't have the political power to pass your law or to do whatever in that moment, at least don't participate in the lie, right? That's huge. Be dynamic rather than reactive. Don't abet the concentration camp tendency. There's tremendous power in calling out wrong things as being wrong. And I was heartened to see Representative Murray go to bat for the NIH employees who put their careers on the line yesterday. That's a great example. And you probably don't know it, but the German Reichstag actually partially defunded a genocidal war at the start of the 20th century in Southwest Africa after they learned what was happening there. So letting people know in your small community, in your political community, at the national level, what's going on is critical. It's a long battle. That thing I said where the Congress was the one that undid the McCarran Internal Security Act that Congress had put in years before that stopped the ability to detain dissidents in camps. And so there are many, many things our policymakers can do. They can support those courts. They can think about judicial appointments that they approve. But for people on the ground in their communities, you hold tremendous power too. And a lot of people don't know this, but research has shown that the 2020 protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder actually shifted public opinion, voting patterns, police funding in some important ways. Communities reevaluate their relationships to law enforcement. And the effects of these protests at first were quite negative, but they had a really important effect months later. And protests, this is so important to hear, protests were more critical, had relatively more strength in counties with smaller and lower educated and more white populations. And my guess is that some of those communities are politically checked out or are not actually seeing what's going on. And even that little bit of exposure is enough to make people rethink. So I would echo Erica in terms of organizing your community, see who's already organized, but you and 5 neighbors making a protest is still a valuable and important thing. And it isn't just to make you feel better, it's to have effects. But in concrete things, since you want specifics, I'm going to close with big specifics. We need to support targeted communities, their court battles, and the people fighting for them and with them. Give to local bail and bond funds for protesters and for families of detained immigrants and immigrants. Fight on every front. Don't give anything up. Make everything harder and slower. That is a huge aspect of slowing down repression. For instance, the current attorney general's brother not winning president of the DC bar was something that happened last week, and it's huge. it not happening is not going to change much. But if it had happened, it could have opened doors to a lot of things. So sometimes just winning those kinds of things are important to try to keep the rule of law intact. Support those doing pro bono law work. And everybody needs to use their right to dissent to make demands on the government in a big national movement, but also in small ways close to home, like Erica was talking about. Things at your library with access to books, things with where can trans teens go in your community? Is there a place to help them? Things for not just offering things down, right? But think about mutual aid. What kind of networks are you building where you're not just helping somebody, but you're building a community? Because the opposite of what repressive government wants to happen is communities that are in touch, that are able to act and help each other. And so the more we build that, the less this stuff can take root and the easier it is to reverse what's already going on.
That is an extraordinary and empowering note to end on from both of you. I want to thank really sincerely Andrea Pitzer and Erica Chenoweth for taking part in this important and timely discussion and for your many years of work that has laid the foundation for us to feel, even amid the darkness, just a little bit of light and to have some tools and some space to maneuver. And thanks to everybody who has tuned in, who shared questions, who's continuing to share questions here, and who's committed to this important conversation. We will follow up with some of these references and sources. We'll get together and figure out the best way to share those out. If you would like to be continue to be in conversation, or if you plan to do additional work in this area and on these issues, the best way to contact all three of us, any of us, is at our personal websites, andreapitzer.com, ericachenoweth.com, amifieldsmeyer.com. And a big thank you to the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, to Erica's Nonviolent Action Lab, and to the Ash Center, everybody here at the Harvard Kennedy School. We're very, very grateful for everybody who's tuned in, and please continue the conversation in your communities. Thank you.